Well, there's a little exhibition on at the museum, Jersey Museum at the moment, about Jersey's involvement in the slave trade, as it's usually called, the slave trade. And of course we've had some activity here because of Sir George Carteret. It was a big name in British politics at the end of the 17th century, early 18th century. And he was very much involved with the foundation of Jersey's participation because of the Royal Africa Company, when they gave them a big present of a huge part of America. And of course there's a colony, and this exhibition explains that they wanted to develop the colony, but they wanted labor to do it. And the economy of the European economy throughout the 17th and 18th century depended upon slavery for doing the work. They were the steam engines of before the steam engine became the machine. So millions of Africans were taken into service as slaves in lots of places, North and South America, the West Indies, and other places. And it was a dreadful business. And the repercussions, the implications of it, have still not worked through the system. Fortunes were made, and all sorts of discrimination was created, which is still with us. And of course, some of the wealth is still here. A lot of the banks that were set up, lots of people made their fortunes in slave-related activities, and that was invested in or money borrowed from banks. And of course, they've all been absorbed now into supposedly respectable banks, finance houses. That's how it happens. That's how history is, isn't it? Things change. Now, Sir George, there's a statue of him at St. Peter's in Jersey outside a pub. And of course, he had a remarkable career, and he was an Andros in Guernsey was the same. Very important people in the colonial development of America. Very important people, but much involved in slavery. And George was also involved in the Hudson's Bay Company further up in Canada, and the exploitation of the native Canadians was carrying on into the 1960s and still hasn't been resolved. So these things have long-term implications. Now, of course, you can't show it all in a little exhibition like this. Look, random dates, the roots of transatlantic slavery, Jersey's linked to transatlantic slavery. What I've found over the years, it's very difficult to get to original material. Now, they've done well here. They've got a lot of good stuff here about a bad trade, if it can be good. There's information which isn't generally available. But I've found, and the same in Bristol, there's very few families have got archives of their own, of the slave, their involvement, their ancestors' involvement in the slave trade. It's almost as though there has been, over the past couple of 100 years, a deliberate effort to get rid of the information. Now, there was a very interesting television series on houses and who used to live in them. And they picked on one week, a black historian was focusing on Guinea Street in Bristol, which was built in about 1715. Well, it's pretty obvious what Guinea Street was named after. And obviously it was a slaver who built the houses, and there were slave traders living in the houses for some time. But one of the curious facts is, a guy called Shebbeare, Dr. Shebbeare, lived in these houses. And Shebbeare was a great friend and promoter of Tom Grouchy. Now, Tom Grouchy was the leader of the Jersey Revolution in 1769. But of course, he was also involved in the slave trade when he lived in Boston. Now, Boston was another great centre for the slave trade. And of course it was very handy between Newfoundland and South America for the trade. Fish wasn't just served up on nice, for Fridays for the Roman Catholics. It was one of the staple foods for the slave traders, the poor quality fish. And the trade, this slave trade, isn't just about carrying people across the Atlantic and being nasty to them. It's about the trade that went on. The sugar, huge business in sugar, cotton, indigo, all these products which were desperately needed in Europe were all the results of slave trade, slave labour producing them. So the enormity of it is sort of difficult to... This little exhibition attempts to show that, but it's difficult to grasp. They concentrate to some extent on the Gabarel family because there's a local link, and they had an inquiry came to Jersey from South America, from Belize or Honduras, as it's been variously called, which at this time was a Spanish territory, and there was a lot of smuggling went on with Belize and Honduras, and several Jersey families were involved because smuggling was another aspect of the trade. The Queen Anne, when she came to the throne, she had a huge entitlement to supply slaves, initially to French colonies, and then to Spanish colonies. And it became part of the famous the bubble that burst, the finance bubble. But she had this contract which went through the Kings George First and Second. They inherited to supply thousands of slaves to the Spanish colonies. And it was very lucrative. So it isn't just the ordinary little guys, the traders. This is a thing that was at the highest level in British society and French society and Spanish society. It had that sort of the royal patronage. And this is all has to be appreciated. You can get some flavour of it here at this exhibition. You can see, and there's this, the Gabarel, there's people here as they discovered. There are descendants now from that Gabarel family. They have links, they weren't aware of them. They don't record this stuff through the families. The South American inquiry said, well, why have we got this Jersey name? When they inquire, they find out why. Now, as I say, Tom Grouchy, the hero of the Jersey uprising in 1769, he was involved in slavery to some extent. I don't know to what extent. And one of the difficulties is finding the evidence. You have to find little bits. And I think a lot of the evidence has either been kept secret and hidden away, burned on bonfires, accidentally or deliberately, I do not know. The same in Bristol. Very few Bristol families have got archives of their involvement in the slave trade. Lots of Bristol was bombed. Lots of records would have been destroyed. But I'm amazed that there's so little direct family understanding. You see, there's a nice little house there. Montplaisir was built with profits from the cod trade. Well, that used to be the Marett family household. Very respectable family in the 20th, 21st centuries. But if they were in the cod trade in the 18th century, they were almost certainly supplying fish and other goods for the slaves down in the West Indies or in the American. And that has to be understood, that it isn't just catching fish and selling it for nice fish and chip suppers. There's a great deal. Fabrics was another huge part for the simple clothes that the slaves wore. It had to come from somewhere. So, we're none of us clean in regards to this. Now, Bristol had that famous out, and it's referred to here, that famous, the pulling down of Edward Colston's statue. But this campaign, the Black Campaign, has been going on for a long time. And I found recently a book which I'd never heard of before, written by a chap called Williams in 1944. And he was dealing with all the issues that are raised in this exhibition here, especially the aspect which had never occurred to me about the compensation that was paid not to the slaves, but to the owners of the slaves. When the slavery was made illegal, the owners were paid compensation. And there were quite a few in Jersey who were paid considerable sums of money. But in places like Bristol, Liverpool, London, the main centres of the trade, and if they had plantations, if they still had links to slaves, which lots of them did, they received considerable sums of money. The poor old slaves, they got nothing out of that. So it's a complex scenario. Now, I would recommend anybody, if they're interested, if you want to talk about international finance centres, and you want to see how these places come about to be international finance centres, part of your essential learning should be to look at the slave trade and the ancillary, the bits that went with it, the smuggling that went with it, the piracy that went with it. These were all linked. Now, it's different days now, but of course, it still happens. There's still much slavery going on in the world. And as we know, in the Channel Islands, there were slaves here during the occupation. And slavery was rife throughout Europe. Just a change. Same people, educated people, but resorting to slavery, given the opportunity. So we need to look at what we're doing. Places like Rwanda, where we're getting very involved with Jersey, trying to develop a finance industry. But I think we, the public in Jersey, should know much more about what we're getting involved with in Rwanda, because it isn't just about Jersey cows. There are aspects of the business which I think, and the government in Rwanda, and we're going to start exporting people, refugees. That's the plan. People who've got a disastrous situation because their country is being bombed or whatever is happening to them, and they're going to be arbitrarily shipped out to Rwanda, somebody else's territory. Now, it smacks of the worst sort of discrimination, but it also smacks of slavery, the same thinking process. And we in Jersey should know much more about that trade and a lot more about the trade which is behind the finance industry, which of course is like the slave trade in its day. It's largely secret. We don't know what's going on. We're not allowed to know. We can't go down to the finance centre and say, oh, please can you tell me what your businesses are doing? They won't tell you. Are you involved in mining for rare metals so that we can fuel electric cars? They won't tell us that. We don't know. We see little glimpses of children being exploited. But this little exhibition indicates, it doesn't spell it out, but if you have a mind to think, and I hope you will come and see it, there are glimpses here of something very, very unsavory.